The dark legacy. King David and the tragedy of his son's blood spills easily in the House of Kings. Power, lust, betrayal. These forces have toppled empires and shattered families throughout history. Yet few tales illustrate this truth more vividly than the story of Israel's greatest king and the devastating fate that befell his household. King David, shepherd boy, giant slayer, psalmist and ruler, stands as one of history's most complex figures. His triumphs inspire, his passion captivates, and his faith continues to echo through millennia. But behind the glory lies a shadow, a darkness that consumed his family and forever altered the course of his dynasty. This is not merely a story of ancient tragedy. It is a profound meditation on power, sin, and consequence that speaks directly to our human condition. The legacy of David reveals an uncomfortable truth. Even the greatest among us can fall, and when we do, the consequences often extend far beyond ourselves. In the intimate theater of family life, these consequences play out in devastating clarity, revealing that the sword of judgment cuts most deeply into those we love most. The fateful choice Jerusalem basked in the midday sun, the city of David crowned in splendor atop Mount Zion. It was the season when kings went to war, yet the king of Israel remained behind. His armies were far away, besieging the Ammonite capital of Rabbah under the command of his loyal general, Joab. But David, the warrior king who had fought countless battles, chose comfort over leadership. Marcus, a royal scribe who had faithfully served the king since his ascension, later remarked, "His absence from the battlefield was the first sign. Great men often fall not in moments of struggle, but in seasons of ease." That fateful afternoon, David rose from his bed and strolled along the palace rooftop. The elevation of the royal residence afforded him an unobstructed view of the surrounding homes and courtyards. In one such courtyard, a woman bathed. The water cascaded over her form, catching the sunlight in a way that made her seem to glow against the stone walls. David stood transfixed. Her beauty struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had many wives already, as was customary for kings. But something about this woman awakened a consuming desire. "Who is she?" he demanded of a nearby servant. After inquiries, the servant returned with information. "She is Bathsheba, my lord, the daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite." The mention of Uriah should have stopped him. Uriah was one of David's mighty men, an elite warrior who had fought alongside the king for years, risking his life for David and for Israel. At that very moment, Uriah was at the battlefront where David himself should have been. But the king had stepped onto a slippery slope of poor decisions. The emptiness of the palace, the idleness of his days, and now this vision of beauty, all conspired to silence his conscience. "Bring her to me," David commanded. The royal messengers delivered his summons to Bathsheba's home. She came to the palace, perhaps fearful of refusing the king's command. Whatever her feelings, anxiety, flattery, reluctance, ambition, the biblical record remains silent on them. It speaks only of the deed itself. David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. What happened in the royal chamber that evening shattered multiple covenants. David's covenant with God, his obligation to protect his subjects rather than exploit them, Bathsheba's marriage covenant with Uriah. In a culture where purity was paramount and adultery counted among the gravest sins, David had abused his power for momentary pleasure. After their encounter, Bathsheba returned home, the palace guards escorting her through darkened streets. Both likely believed the matter concluded, a secret indiscretion buried in the shadows of power. But some secrets refuse to remain hidden. Weeks later, a message arrived from Bathsheba. "I am pregnant." 2 simple words that sent the king into panic. The timing would make it impossible to claim the child belonged to Uriah, who had been away at war. Discovery meant scandal at best, and at worst, death for both David and Bathsheba under the law of Moses. Rather than confess his sin, David chose deception. He summoned Uriah from the battlefield, ostensibly to report on the war's progress. The real purpose was transparently manipulative. David hoped Uriah would visit his wife during his brief return, thus providing cover for Bathsheba's pregnancy. When Uriah arrived at the palace, David greeted him warmly, inquiring about Job, the troops, and the progress of the siege. Then he said, "Go down to your house and wash your feet," a euphemism suggesting Uriah should enjoy his wife's company. But Uriah did not go home. Instead, he slept at the entrance of the palace with the servants. The next day, David questioned him. "Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's response revealed a man of principle and solidarity. "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Job and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." His integrity stood in stark contrast to David's moral failure. Uriah refused comforts that his fellow soldiers could not enjoy, while David had indulged in pleasures that were not rightfully his to take. David tried again. He invited Uriah to dine with him, plying him with wine until he was drunk, hoping intoxication would overcome his resolve. But even drunk, Uriah maintained his integrity and again slept at the palace rather than returning home. With his scheme failing, David's desperation grew. If he could not hide his sin, he would eliminate the one person whose presence made it impossible to conceal. The next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah himself. "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." Uriah carried his own death warrant back to the battlefield, unaware of the treachery of the king he had served so faithfully. He died as commanded, placed in a vulnerable position during an assault on the city. When news of Uriah's death reached Jerusalem, David feigned an appropriate response for public consumption. "Don't let this upset you," he told Joab's messenger. "The sword devours one as well as another." After Bathsheba completed the customary period of mourning for her husband, David brought her to the palace as his wife. The child was born, and to outward appearances, the matter was resolved. But the eyes of the Lord see what remains hidden from men. The confrontation, the prophet Nathan entered the royal court, his weathered face grave. David welcomed him as always, respecting the prophet's wisdom and his direct connection to God. For years, Nathan had been a trusted spiritual advisor, delivering both divine promises and guidance. Unaware of what was to come, David sat back as Nathan began to tell a story. There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now, a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David's reaction was immediate and fierce. "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. The king's anger flared at this injustice, blind to the irony that he was condemning his own actions. Nathan let the moment hang in the air, the tension building as David awaited his response. Then the prophet raised his finger, pointing directly at the king. "You are the man." The words struck David like physical blows as Nathan continued relentlessly. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." The facade David had carefully constructed crumbled instantly. In that moment, he could not hide behind his power or pretense. The sin he had concealed from his people stood exposed before God and his prophet. Nathan's voice lowered, becoming even more ominous as he delivered God's sentence. "Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." The prophecy continued, detailing how calamity would arise from within David's own household, how his wives would be taken from him in public humiliation, how the son born to Bathsheba would die. Unlike Saul before him, who had made excuses when confronted with his disobedience, David responded with immediate contrition. "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan acknowledged this confession, but made it clear that repentance would not erase all consequences. "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." After Nathan left, David retreated to his private chamber. Zerah, his most trusted attendant, later described finding the king prostrate on the ground, his royal robes discarded, wearing only sackcloth. "I had seen him face giants and armies without fear," Zerah recounted. "But never had I seen him so undone as in those hours when he faced the weight of his own sin. For 7 days, David fasted and pleaded with God for the child's life. He refused food and comfort, spending nights on the floor in prayer and lamentation. The palace staff whispered among themselves, uncertain how to respond to this display of raw anguish from their normally commanding king. On the 7th day, the child died. The servants feared telling David, whispering among themselves, "If he was so distraught while the child lived, what will he do when we tell him the child is dead?" But David, noticing their hushed conversations, asked directly, "Is the child dead?" When they confirmed it, David did something unexpected. He rose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, changed his clothes, and went to the house of the Lord to worship. Then he returned to the palace and ate. His servants, bewildered by this change, questioned him. David explained, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." This acceptance revealed David's understanding of divine sovereignty and his submission to God's judgment. Though he had pleaded for mercy, he accepted the consequences of his actions with dignity when the final judgment came. Later, David comforted Bathsheba, and she conceived again. The son born to them was named Solomon, and the biblical record notes that the Lord loved him. Through Nathan, God gave Solomon another name, Jedediah, meaning loved by the Lord. In this child, a sign of restoration appeared, a promise that God's covenant with David would continue despite his failure. Yet the prophet's words still hung over the royal household like a sword. Calamity would come from within, and violence would plague his family for generations to come. The first fulfillment of this dark prophecy would arrive through David's firstborn son, Amnon, whose unchecked desires would mirror his father's fateful choice and bring the initial wound to the house of David. The violation Amnon, David's firstborn son, paced the floors of his quarters, consumed by an obsession that violated the most fundamental boundaries of family. His half-sister Tamar, daughter of David and Maacah, had captured his thoughts in a way that tormented him day and night. The biblical text states it plainly. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Amnon confided in his cousin Jonadab, son of David's brother Shimei. Unlike the honorable Uriah, Jonadab represented the darker aspects of the royal court, clever, observant, and morally compromised. "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning?" Jonadab asked. "Won't you tell me?" When Amnon admitted his forbidden desire for Tamar, rather than counseling restraint, Jonadab devised a scheme. "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," he advised. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand.'" Amnon followed this advice, taking to his bed and feigning illness. When King David visited, Amnon made his request, and the king, seeing nothing inappropriate in a sister caring for her sick brother, sent Tamar to help. Tamar arrived at Amnon's house, bringing the dough she had prepared. She formed it into cakes while he watched, then baked them. When she brought the food to him, Amnon refused to eat. "Send everyone out of here," he commanded his servants, creating the isolation he needed for his terrible plan. Once they were alone, he said to Tamar, "Bring the food here into my bedroom, so I may eat from your hand." Tamar, still suspecting nothing, brought the cakes she had made to her brother in his bedroom. But as she approached him with the food, he grabbed her wrist. "Come to bed with me, my sister," he demanded. Terror flooded Tamar's face as she realized his intentions. "No, my brother," she cried out. "Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." Her mind racing, she tried to reason with him even in her fear. "What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." This was likely a desperate attempt to delay him, as marriage between half-siblings was forbidden under Mosaic law. But Amnon, consumed by lust, was beyond reasoning. He refused to listen to her. The biblical account states with chilling simplicity, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. In a psychological twist that reveals the true nature of his feelings, Amnon's passion immediately transformed into hatred after the assault. The Bible states that Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. "Get up and get out," he ordered. Tamar, devastated by this further humiliation, protested. "No, sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me." But Amnon called his personal servant. "Get this woman out of my sight, and bolt the door after her." The servant forced Tamar out and bolted the door. Tamar's response speaks volumes about the cultural significance of what had happened to her. She put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. This public display, the torn royal garment, the ashes, the unrestrained weeping, announced to all that she had been violated. In a culture where a woman's value was inextricably linked to her purity, Tamar's life, as she had known it, was destroyed. Her brother Absalom found her in this state, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you?" he asked, immediately grasping what had happened. "Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." These words, while seemingly dismissive, may have been Absalom's way of calming his traumatized sister while concealing his own growing rage. The text tells us that Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. Tamar, her future shattered, lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. The description is heartbreaking, not just sad, but desolate, suggesting a permanent state of devastation from which there was no recovery in that culture. When King David heard of these events, he was furious. Yet strikingly, the record shows no action on his part. He did not confront Amnon. He did not seek justice for Tamar. He did not punish his firstborn son for this grievous crime. Iliana, a handmaiden who attended the women of David's household, later observed, "The king's silence spoke volumes. Perhaps seeing his own sin reflected in his son paralyzed him, or perhaps he simply could not bear to punish the son who, in his position as firstborn, represented David's legacy." Whatever David's reasons, his inaction had devastating consequences. The sword that Nathan had prophesied was now fully unsheathed within the royal family, and Absalom's quiet hatred would soon transform into a vengeance that would bring the next catastrophe upon the house of David. The vengeance 2 full years passed after Amnon's assault on Tamar. For 2 years, Absalom nursed his hatred, watching as Amnon continued his life unpunished. While Tamar remained secluded in his house, her spirit crushed. For 2 years, David took no action, allowing the bitter wound in his family to fester. During this time, Absalom's demeanor toward Amnon betrayed nothing of his true feelings. He maintained a careful mask of normalcy while methodically planning his revenge. As one royal advisor later recalled, Absalom's patience was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. It was the calm of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Absalom arranged for a sheep-shearing festival at Baal-Hazor, near the border of Ephraim. Sheep-shearing was traditionally a time of celebration and feasting, and it was customary for family members to attend. Absalom approached King David with an invitation. "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" David declined, not wanting to be a burden, but Absalom pressed him. "If not you, then at least let my brother Amnon come along with us." "Why should he go with you?" David asked, perhaps sensing something in Absalom's insistence. But Absalom persisted until David relented, allowing not only Amnon but all the king's sons to attend the celebration. Before the feast, Absalom gathered his servants and issued specific instructions. "Watch for when Amnon is in high spirits from wine. When I say, 'Strike Amnon down,' then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave." The feast began with the appearance of normality. Food and wine flowed freely, and the king's sons enjoyed the celebration, unaware of what was to come. Amnon, as Absalom had anticipated, drank heavily, his guard lowered by the wine, and the seeming reconciliation with his brother. He never saw the danger approaching. When Amnon was sufficiently intoxicated, Absalom gave the signal. His servants fell upon Amnon with sudden violence, striking him repeatedly until he lay dead among the feast tables. The other sons of David watched in horror as their brother's blood mingled with the spilled wine. Panic erupted. The king's sons fled, mounting their mules and racing back toward Jerusalem. In the chaos, a rumor spread ahead of them. Absalom had killed all the king's sons, not just Amnon. This exaggerated report reached David before the survivors did. The king tore his garments and lay on the ground in anguish, surrounded by his servants, who also tore their clothes in solidarity with his grief. But Jonadab, the same cousin who had helped Amnon plan his assault on Tamar, spoke up. "My lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's plan from the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar." Even as Jonadab was speaking, the surviving princes arrived, weeping loudly and confirming that only Amnon had been killed. Meanwhile, Absalom fled to Geshur, to the house of his maternal grandfather, King Talmai. There he would remain in exile for 3 years, separated from his father and from Jerusalem. David mourned for Amnon daily, but in time his grief subsided. The biblical account tells us that eventually King David longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. This longing revealed the complexity of David's feelings: grief for one son, yearning for the other, and perhaps a growing recognition of his own culpability in the tragedy. His failure to address Amnon's crime had created the vacuum in which Absalom's vigilante justice had flourished. Yet, despite this longing, David took no action to bring Absalom home. The relationship remained severed, frozen in the aftermath of bloodshed. It was Joab, David's nephew, and the commander of his army, who finally intervened. Perceiving the king's internal conflict, Joab devised a scheme to facilitate Absalom's return. He summoned a wise woman from Tekoa and instructed her to approach the king with a fabricated story designed to parallel his situation with Absalom. The woman appeared before David in mourning clothes, threw herself prostrate before him, and cried, "Help me, your majesty." When David asked what troubled her, she spun a tale about her 2 sons who had fought in a field with no one to separate them. One had killed the other, and now the family demanded the death of the surviving son as punishment, which would leave her without any heir to carry on her husband's name. After David promised to protect her son, the woman challenged him. "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son." Recognizing Joab's hand in this drama, David nevertheless accepted the message. He summoned Joab and authorized Absalom's return to Jerusalem. However, he added a significant restriction: let him return to his own house, but he must not see my face. So Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but lived in his own house for 2 full years without seeing his father. The partial reconciliation only heightened the tensions in the royal family. Absalom, growing increasingly frustrated, sent messages to Joab, seeking his help to gain access to the king. When Joab ignored his requests, Absalom had his servants set fire to Joab's barley field to force a confrontation. The tactic worked. Joab came to Absalom, who complained, "Why have I come from Shur? It would be better for me if I were still there. Now let me see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death." Joab brought this message to David, who finally consented to see his son. When Absalom entered the king's presence, he prostrated himself, and David kissed him in a gesture of reconciliation. But the kiss concealed unresolved wounds. David had failed to properly address both Amnon's crime and Absalom's revenge. The reconciliation was superficial, papering over deeper issues of justice, accountability, and the proper use of power, issues that would soon erupt in a far more devastating confrontation. The rebellion, the outward reconciliation between David and Absalom, masked a deeper estrangement. Absalom, though welcomed back to Jerusalem, harbored resentments that transformed into ambition. If his father would not administer justice properly, perhaps it was time for a new king. Absalom began a deliberate campaign to win the hearts of the people. He procured a chariot and horses, along with 50 men to run ahead of him, symbols of royal status. that created a visual impression of authority. Rising early each morning, he would position himself by the road to the city gate, where people came to present their disputes for royal judgment. When anyone approached with a case to bring before the king, Absalom would call out, "What city are you from?" After hearing their tribe of origin, he would say, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." Then would come his calculated political masterstroke. "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Whenever someone approached to bow before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of them, and kiss them, an intimate gesture that broke down formal barriers and created a sense of personal connection. Through these calculated actions, Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. After 4 years of such maneuvering, Absalom judged the time ripe for action. He approached David with a seemingly innocent request. "Let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow I made to the Lord." David, suspecting nothing, gave his blessing. But Absalom's true purpose was revolution. He sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel with instructions. "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 invited guests from Jerusalem accompanied Absalom, though the text notes they were unaware of what was happening. Among Absalom's conspirators was Ahithophel, David's trusted counselor, whose defection particularly wounded the king and significantly strengthened Absalom's position. Darius, a merchant who traveled regularly between Hebron and Jerusalem, later described the atmosphere. "It was as if a spell had been cast over the people. Men who had sung David's praises for decades now shouted for Absalom with equal fervor." Loyalty is a fickle thing, easily swayed by charisma and promises of better days. When news of the conspiracy reached David in Jerusalem, he immediately grasped its seriousness. Rather than fortify the city for a siege, he made the surprising decision to flee. "We must leave immediately," he told his household, "or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must go at once, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring disaster on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." This decision revealed David's concern for Jerusalem's inhabitants. A battle within the city walls would result in tremendous civilian casualties. By drawing Absalom away from Jerusalem, David hoped to spare its people while creating space to organize his response. So began one of the most poignant journeys in Scripture. The king of Israel leaving his capital city as a fugitive, accompanied by his household, his loyal guards, and those officials who remained faithful to him. The biblical account captures the emotional weight of this departure. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. Among those who accompanied David were the priests Zadok and Abiathar, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest symbolizing God's presence with Israel. But David commanded them to return the ark to Jerusalem, saying, "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." This statement revealed David's submission to divine judgment. Unlike Absalom, who seized what he wanted through manipulation and force, David acknowledged God's authority to give and take away the throne. His willingness to accept God's verdict, even if it went against him, demonstrated the spiritual maturity that had developed through his many trials. As David ascended the Mount of Olives, he walked barefoot with his head covered, signs of mourning and humility. He and all the people with him wept as they climbed the mountain, a stark contrast to the triumphant procession that had once brought the ark to Jerusalem. During this ascent, David learned that Ahithophel had joined Absalom's conspiracy. This betrayal by his trusted adviser struck David deeply, prompting him to pray, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." At the summit, David was met by Hushai the Archite, a loyal friend who had torn his clothes and put dust on his head in mourning for the king's situation. David recognized an opportunity and asked Hushai to return to Jerusalem, pretend allegiance to Absalom, and work to undermine Ahithophel's counsel from within. This strategic decision would later prove crucial to David's survival. Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem with his forces, including Ahithophel. The counselor's first advice to the new self-proclaimed king was shocking in its calculation. "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." This advice served a dual purpose. It would make reconciliation between David and Absalom impossible, thus committing Absalom's supporters fully to his cause. And it would fulfill Nathan's prophecy to David years earlier. "Before your very eyes will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight." Absalom followed this counsel, setting up a tent on the palace roof, the very place where David had first seen Bathsheba, and publicly took possession of his father's concubines. The sword that Nathan had prophesied continued to cut deeply through David's house. As David gathered his forces east of Jerusalem, Absalom sought Ahithophel's further advice. The council recommended an immediate pursuit with 12,000 men to strike, while David was weary and weak. But Hushai, implementing David's counterintelligence strategy, opposed this plan. He argued for gathering a much larger force before attacking, playing on Absalom's fear and vanity. "You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. I advise that all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle." Absalom and his officials preferred Hushai's advice over Ahithophel's, a development the Bible explicitly attributes to divine intervention. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on order to bring disaster. Absalom, recognizing that his counsel had been rejected and foreseeing Absalom's ultimate defeat, Ahithophel returned to his hometown, put his affairs in order, and hanged himself. A tragic end to a man once renowned for wisdom. Hushai immediately sent word to David through the priest's sons, warning him to cross the Jordan River that very night. Despite difficulties and near discovery, the message reached David, who led his people across the river before dawn, removing them from immediate danger. By the time Absalom marshaled his forces and appointed his cousin Amasa as commander, David had established a base at Mahanaim, where he received supplies and reinforcements from sympathetic allies. The stage was set for the decisive battle between father and son, a confrontation that would bring the next tragic fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy. The heartbreak, as the two armies prepared for battle, David organized his forces into 3 divisions under the command of Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. He announced his intention to lead them personally, but his men objected. "You must not go out with us. If we have to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city." The king yielded to their counsel, standing by the gate as his troops marched out. But he gave his commanders a public order that revealed his conflicted heart. "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." This instruction, spoken loudly enough for all the soldiers to hear, exposed David's continued love for his rebellious son. Even as Absalom sought his throne and his life, David's paternal instinct remained to protect rather than punish. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, a terrain that favored David's smaller but more experienced forces. The biblical account reports that the battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. Amid the chaos of combat, Absalom encountered some of David's men. Riding on his mule, he attempted to flee, but his head, perhaps with his famously luxuriant hair, became caught in the thick branches of a large oak. The mule continued on, leaving Absalom suspended between heaven and earth. A soldier who saw this reported it to Joab. "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Why didn't you strike him to the ground?" Joab demanded. "I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." The man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, 'Protect the young man Absalom for my sake.'" The soldier's response demonstrates how widely known David's concern for Absalom was among the ranks. But Joab, ever the pragmatist, focused on the kingdom's stability rather than family sentiment, would not be constrained by such consideration. "I'm not going to wait like this for you," he said, taking 3 javelins in his hand. Joab went to where Absalom hung helpless and thrust them into his heart. Then his 10 armor-bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Joab then blew the trumpet to halt the pursuit of Israel's troops, considering the battle effectively over with Absalom's death. His men buried Absalom in a large pit in the forest and piled a huge heap of rocks over him, a dishonorable burial contrasting sharply with the grand monument Absalom had built for himself in the King's Valley. Thinking, "I have no son to carry on the carry. Memory of my name." The question now became who would inform David of his son's death. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, volunteered, but Joab initially refused, sending a Cushite messenger instead. After the Cushite departed, Ahimaaz persisted until Joab relented and allowed him to run as well. Being faster, Ahimaaz overtook the Cushite and reached David first. The king, waiting anxiously at the city gate, asked immediately about Absalom's safety. Ahimaaz, perhaps fearing to deliver the terrible news, replied vaguely about seeing a great commotion, but claimed not to know the details. When the Cushite arrived, David again asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite answered with a thinly veiled euphemism, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The biblical description of David's response captures the full weight of his grief. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son, my son, my son, my son, if only I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son." This raw lament, the cry of a father transcending the concerns of a king, reveals the depth of David's love for his rebellious son. Even after all Absalom had done, David would have sacrificed himself to save him. News of the king's grief spread quickly through the returning army, transforming what should have been a triumphant homecoming into a shameful procession. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. Meanwhile, David remained secluded, continuing to mourn, covering his face and crying aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son, my son, my son." Joab, recognizing the damaging effect this had on morale, confronted the king harshly. "Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life, and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and hate those who love you. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall." This stark rebuke forced David to compose himself and publicly acknowledge his troops, sitting at the city gate as they paraded before him. Yet one senses that he did so mechanically, his heart still broken by the loss of his son. A loss that represented yet another tragic fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy. The rebellion ended, but the scars it left on David and on the kingdom would never fully heal. The sword continued to hang over the house of David, and would soon strike again as questions of succession arose in the king's final years. The succession years passed, and King David grew old. His body, once powerful enough to slay giants and lead armies, now failed him. The biblical account tells us that even when they put covers over him, he could not keep warm. A young woman named Abishag the Shunammite was brought to attend him and provide warmth, though the text specifically notes that the king had no sexual relations with her. As David's strength waned, the question of succession loomed large. Though he had previously promised the throne to Solomon, his son with Bathsheba, another son saw opportunity in the king's decline. Adonijah, David's fourth son, and the eldest surviving after the deaths of Amnon and Absalom, began positioning himself as heir apparent. The biblical description of him echoes Absalom. He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. Like his rebellious brother before him, Adonijah prepared chariots and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him, the trappings of royalty. The text adds a revealing detail about David's parenting. His father had never rebuked him by asking, "Why do you behave as you do?" This pattern of non-confrontation with his sons continued to bear bitter fruit in David's final years. Adonijah secured the support of Joab, the long-serving military commander, and Abiathar, one of the two high priests. These alliances gave him both military and religious backing for his claim. However, several significant figures remained loyal to David: Zadok the priest, Benaiah commander of the royal guard, Nathan the prophet, and the king's mighty men. Most importantly, Nathan knew of David's promise to Bathsheba that Solomon would be the next king, a promise apparently made under divine guidance. Sensing the growing conspiracy, Nathan approached Bathsheba with urgency. "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and our Lord David knows nothing about it? Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon." Nathan instructed Bathsheba to remind David of his promise regarding Solomon's succession, warning her that if Adonijah consolidated power, both she and Solomon would likely be executed as threats to the new regime. Bathsheba went to David's chamber, where Abishag was attending him. She bowed low and prostrated herself. "What is it you want?" the king asked. "My lord," she said, "you yourself swore to me by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it. If you do not act, as soon as my lord the king is laid to rest with his ancestors, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals." While she was still speaking, Nathan the prophet arrived, corroborating her account and adding details about Adonijah's celebratory feast, where her supporters were proclaiming, "Long live King Adonijah." "Is this what my lord the king has decided?" Nathan asked pointedly. without letting his servants know who should sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. These coordinated appeals stirred David to decisive action. He summoned Bathsheba back to his presence and renewed his oath. As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place. With renewed vigor, David issued commands to ensure Solomon's immediate installation as king. He instructed Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah to place Solomon on the royal mule, itself a public symbol of succession, and lead him to Gihon. There they were to anoint him with oil from the sacred horn kept in the tabernacle, blow the trumpet, and proclaim, "Long live King Solomon." The procession moved through Jerusalem with great fanfare. At Gihon, Zadok anointed Solomon while the people rejoiced so loudly that the ground shook with the sound. When news of these events reached Adonijah and his guests, their celebration came to an abrupt halt. Joab, ever alert to shifting political winds, asked about the commotion from the city. As they were speaking, Jonathan, son of Abiathar, arrived with news that shattered Adonijah's ambitions. David had made Solomon king. Terror seized Adonijah's guests, who rose up, scattered, and fled. Adonijah himself, fearing Solomon's retribution, rushed to the altar and grabbed its horns, a traditional place of sanctuary. There he remained until receiving Solomon's conditional pardon. If he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, but if evil is found in him, he will die. With this dramatic intervention, David secured the succession for Solomon. But the aged king recognized that his son would need guidance for the challenges ahead. He summoned Solomon and delivered his final counsel. "I am about to go the way of all the earth. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go." David then addressed unresolved matters requiring Solomon's attention. He specifically mentioned Joab's past killings of Abner and Amasa, murders committed in peacetime for which justice had never been served. He also cited the curses of Shimei, son of Gera, who had violently abused David during his flight from Absalom, yet had received a temporary pardon. These final instructions reflected David's concern for establishing Solomon's reign on foundations of justice, while removing potential threats to the new king's authority. Not long afterward, David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. After a reign of 40 years, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem, the shepherd boy who became Israel's greatest king was gone. Solomon established himself securely on the throne, but Adonijah soon proved that David's concerns about potential threats were justified. In what appeared to be a calculated political move, Adonijah approached Bathsheba with a request. "Would you ask King Solomon? He will not refuse you to give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife." Though Bathsheba agreed to present this petition, Solomon immediately recognized the underlying strategy. In the cultural context of the ancient Near East, taking possession of a royal concubine or attendant was tantamount to claiming rights to the throne. Though Abishag had not been David's concubine in the full sense, her proximity to the late king gave her status that Adonijah sought to appropriate. Solomon's response was swift and final. "Why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my older brother. Today Adonijah shall be put to death." The king dispatched Benaiah, who executed Adonijah, fulfilling David's earlier warning about the consequences of evil intent. Solomon also removed Abiathar from the priesthood, banishing him to his estate in Anathoth, and ordered the execution of Job, who had fled to the altar seeking sanctuary. With these decisive actions, Solomon eliminated the remaining threats to his rule. The sword that had hung over David's house for so long had made its final cuts, clearing the path for what would become a reign of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Solomon would build the temple his father had desired to construct. He would expand Israel's borders and influence to their greatest extent. He would gain renown for his wisdom throughout the ancient world. And through his lineage, the divine promise that a son of David would rule forever would ultimately find fulfillment in the coming of the Messiah. The legacy of broken crowns, the saga of David and his sons, stands as one of history's most profound studies in the paradox of human greatness. Here was a man chosen by God, gifted with extraordinary talents, elevated from shepherd to sovereign, yet whose personal failings triggered a cascade of tragedy that nearly destroyed everything he built. The pattern established in David's fall with Bathsheba repeated through generations. Momentary desire leading to catastrophic consequences, abuse of power bringing destruction rather than fulfillment, and the sword of violence passing from father to sons in a terrible inheritance of bloodshed. Nathan's prophecy that the sword shall never depart from your house proved devastatingly accurate. Violence begat violence in an unbroken chain. David arranged Uriah's death. Amnon violated Tamar. Absalom killed Amnon. Joab killed Absalom, and Solomon executed Adonijah. Each death tore further at the fabric of the royal family, fulfilling the divine judgment pronounced years earlier. Yet within this tragic narrative lies a paradoxical hope. David's story reveals three enduring truths that continue to resonate across millennia. First, power without accountability corrupts even the greatest souls. David's original sin with Bathsheba and against Uriah happened precisely because he was king, because he could command others to fulfill his desires without immediate consequences. This abuse of authority created the pattern his sons would follow in their own ways. Amnon believed his position as firstborn entitled him to take what he wanted from Tamar. Absalom used his privilege to plot rebellion. Adonijah assumed his birth order gave him rights to the throne regardless of his father's wishes. The lesson echoes through history. No one, regardless of position or achievement, stands above moral law. True greatness comes not from exercising power, but from restraining it within the boundaries of justice and compassion. Second, silence in the face of wrongdoing only ensures greater calamity. David's failure to properly address Amnon's crime against Tamar created the vacuum in which Absalom's vigilante justice flourished. The king's pattern of avoiding difficult confrontations with his sons, of never asking, "Why do you behave as you do?" allowed destructive behaviors to grow unchecked until they exploded in violence. How many family tragedies, organizational failures, and societal breakdowns might be avoided if those with authority found the courage to speak truth in moments of wrongdoing? The temporary discomfort of confrontation pales beside the lasting damage of silence. Third, and most hopefully, human failure does not negate divine promise. Despite David's sins and their terrible consequences, God's covenant remained unbroken. The Messiah still came through David's lineage, fulfilling the promise that a son of David would establish an eternal kingdom. This reveals the astounding grace at the heart of the biblical narrative. God accomplishes his purposes not by selecting perfect people, but by working through deeply flawed individuals who recognize their need for redemption. David's greatness ultimately lay not in his achievements, but in his capacity for genuine repentance, his willingness to acknowledge his sins without excuse and throw himself on God's mercy. When Nathan confronted him, David did not deny or justify his actions. He simply said, "I have sinned against the Lord." This honest admission stands in stark contrast to Saul's evasions when similarly confronted. It marks the essential difference between these two kings and explains why, despite his grievous failures, David is still described as a man after God's own heart. The legacy of David reminds us that while consequences of sin may remain, forgiveness and restoration are always possible. This offers hope to all who recognize their own brokenness, that past failures need not determine future possibilities, that divine purposes can still be accomplished through imperfect vessels. The story of David and his sons asks us to consider three questions that remain eternally relevant. Where in our lives have we abused power or privilege to fulfill desires at others' expense? What situations demand that we break silence and speak truth, despite the discomfort or cost? How might we, like David, find the courage to honestly confront our failures rather than hiding behind excuses or self-justification? These questions invite us into the same journey of fallenness, repentance, and restoration that David traveled. A journey that acknowledges the reality of human brokenness while refusing to surrender hope for redemption. For in the end, the story of David is our story too. We share his capacity for both greatness and terrible failure. We experience the consequences of our choices, affecting not only ourselves, but those we love. And we too are offered the possibility of grace that exceeds our faults, of a divine love that works through our weakness to accomplish purposes greater than we could imagine. Thank you for taking this journey through one of Scripture's most powerful narratives. I hope this exploration of David's family tragedy has given you new insights into both the dangers of unchecked power and the possibility of redemption beyond failure. If this video has impacted you, please consider subscribing to the Deep Bible Stories channel for more explorations of Scripture's complex and transformative truths. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How does David's story speak to your own experience of failure, consequence, and the possibility of restoration? May God bless you as you continue to engage with these timeless truths.